Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Q&A session for all you donors. Apologies, it was a little bit delayed, kind of sending the email out. Obviously, you did know it was coming up, so hopefully you weren't too kind of like worried about it. About the delay on the email. One of the reasons for this is the kind of like the real convoluted way in which we have to kind of like collect all the donors' emails. And since I sent out the last email on Wednesday for the Spruce stream, there have been like 6 or 7 new donors, and so kind of like waiting for those to kind of like trickle in so I can get all their emails and then send it all out at once. It's one of the reasons, and then also I had a bit of a disaster with the pump and the hose this morning, so that kind of like occupied my time. We are back on the computer, the super fancy computer, and the internet is all running smoothly. So there should be no problems with the stream. If there are, please tell me in the chat. Just a couple of things, kind of like housekeeping things. You can ask questions live. Do sort of preface it with the word question in big letters. That would help. And if you have asked a question previously and it doesn't get answered, then just remind me in the chat and we'll try and get onto it. Other than that, the one thing that we are looking at doing, we've got kind of in the pipeline, is a bit of a web shop, and that should be online in the next couple of days, hopefully. And I've got to pull my finger out more than the wonderful Simon Hicks who's doing it for me. I know you're here, Simon, so thank you very much for that. And through that web shop, we will be able to do a recurring payment system. So that's kind of like why I've not really been pushing the donations at the moment. So if you are wanting to kind of donate, you just sort of hold your horses a little bit, because we want to go into that new, like go through the web shop, the new system there. The percentages that PayPal take will be slightly lower. Be able to set up a bit more of a recurring payment system easier, and it will also give me that list of people, like for the mailing list, a lot easier, and it's just like all in one place rather than me having to collate all this information from various different places. So please just kind of like hold off a little bit for that. The other thing is this. I mentioned it in the email about this idea of a kind of like a forum come massive WhatsApp group chat called on this app called Discord. Now Discord is something which was kind of like set up for mainly for youths and gamers in particular, and it's basically kind of like a cross between a forum and, like I said, a big sort of group chat, and it's kind of a place for people to kind of talk about just bonsai. What I want is for this to be open to the donors only, not just open to the general public, because it's one way of doing something for those people that are supporting me, and I will be sort of interacting a lot on there, answering people's questions. So basically, people have been emailing me in questions, and sort of replying on just an individual basis. But basically, that information could just as easily be shared with everybody else. So basically, you kind of put it onto these group chats or on this app called Discord, and it should be then everything's visible for everybody else. Dave Gladwin, you said it's a bit jumpy. If anybody's having any issues with the stream and everything, if it's me, I will know about it. If it's the upload side, I'll know about it, because there's red lights start flashing and things like that. At the moment, I've got 0.0 drop frames. YouTube is telling me that the stream is excellent. Stream health is excellent. So if anybody's having issues, then it's likely to be yourself. Jeff Banning had a problem last time, previous stream. Basically, if you're having a bit of issues and nobody else is experiencing them, close the browser, turn it off, turn it back on again, is basically it. And so there's 2 areas for problems. There's me to YouTube, and then there's YouTube to you. At the moment, I can guarantee there's no issues from me to YouTube. Okay, so if you are having issues, look at and nobody else is, then just look at just closing your browser, maybe opening up a different browser, or or doing something. YouTube is generally iffy a bit lately because basically everybody is online, and so people's download speeds are really really kind of like so everyone else is fine, but if you're having like problems with download speeds or YouTube being a bit weird, it's because of the sheer amount of people just watching crap online like this. So that whole Discord thing, we're going to sort of set that up, and feel free to use it or not use it. And basically, if people start turning it into, like, one of the issues with forums I've had before is it can get a little bit toxic, and people can start becoming a little bit just sort of nasty to each other and sort of criticising and things like that. You see it on Facebook a lot. If I am Jeff. If it does turn up, if it does start to do like that, I'll just knock it on the head and I'll just close it. I'd like to think that the people who are watching the stream share a similar type of the people who donate share a similar type of ethos and mentality towards bonsai that I do, and so that hopefully shouldn't happen, and it should be a safe space for people to talk about bonsai. Okay, so there'll be some more information about that in an email very soon. Like I say, might not be for some people, but we're just going to open it up and see how it goes. If it goes terribly wrong, nothing lost. So, all that done. That's 10 minutes. That's 6 minutes of nonsense. Right. So we'll get into some of the questions. So we've got quite a few come through. I've got them here on my phone, so it'd be a bit easier for me to look at like that. Right. So the first question we're going to look at was from Bob McCarlo. Sorry, Bob. How does McCarley? From Bob. And it's about Austrian black pine. I have an Austrian black pine and wanted to know what you recommend for dealing with the buds and candles. When to reduce the number of buds, when to pinch. Do you ever completely decandle? An Austrian pine is a pine that's particularly well used over here. And so I don't have a great amount of experience. There's a couple that I've worked on fairly regularly, and basically I've just treated them exactly the same as a single flush pine, so sort of going alongside Mugos and Scots pines, and so the thinning out of buds and candles can be done basically any time. Everything really is dependent not so much on the species but on like the vigor of the tree, and so if you've got like a super vigorous tree and it's growing really rapidly, then get in there and pinch those candles early, thin out the buds a lot earlier than you would be normally, and so realistically, like the bud thinning kind of is going to be happening towards the end of the year, when all of the new buds are starting to form ready for next year. So we'll be talking about September, October. Be sort of wanting to go through and just have a look at the sort of the bud formation, particularly at the tips. If it's a really vigorous, then you're going to get 3 or 4 bud formations at the tips, and so sort of thinning those out, and then doing that again. The thing with bonsai is you should never just do that the job once. You always then come back and look at the tree again a couple of 3 weeks later, and then again a couple of 3 weeks later. So you do that first kind of round of candle, or not candle, bud thinning out. So where you've got multiple buds coming from one point, September, October. So let's say in September, you go through, thin those out. Then you come back in October, because there's going to be a response to what you've done. Maybe you're starting to get multiple buds in other places, have another go at thinning it out, and then maybe look at it a couple of weeks later just to make sure that you've got a similar kind of number of buds, a similar separation of those buds everywhere. So that's the one thing that we've done, that I've personally done with the couple of Austrian pines that I've worked on, and then looking at doing that once again in the spring. So as things start to grow out in the spring, things start to extend out, and then you start to see potentially new adventitious buds forming in, or starting to grow and to swell up where previously they may have only been very, very small. And so the bud thinning out can be done at those 2 times. And then in terms of the candle, the buds turning into candles and then candles extending, and basically all I've ever done is just approached it from the single flush approach. I do think that I know that some people do go in and sort of completely decandle, but I've never really sort of been brave enough to do that. I've always kind of approached it from a single flush. I know that Mirai Live, and I think you are a Mirai subscriber. I mean, Ryan's just done a stream on Austrian blacks, so look at that as well for some information. But obviously, being in Ontario, where you are, you might have to just kind of approach it from a slightly less aggressive approach than perhaps maybe Ryan does, just slightly further south down in Portland. But like I say, I mean, I've only ever sort of really treated it as a single flush pine, but they are sort of super vigorous here. So just I think one of the biggest issues is trying to get them to not be quite so aggressively, grow aggressively. So hope that helps a little bit. We'll look into. I'll ask a couple of people who have got them and see what they do as well. So just sort of following on from that, we'll stay along with the pines. We'll just ask Jeff's question there. What happens on the black pine if there's plenty of foliage but no apparent buds? So I assume that you mean like at this sort of time now, there's no real buds looking at growing. If no buds form and candles start to extend out now, there is still some possibility of bud formation. So what can happen, for example, is the buds may dry off or get knocked off early in the spring. And particularly if it's a Japanese black pine, then it will be able to kind of set new buds and potentially grow again this year. What I would perhaps do, if you've got a blind shoot with a lot of foliage around the end, what perhaps I'd go in and do is just cut the end of the branch, the tip right at the end, just so you can expose a little bit of the sap and kind of just create a little bit of a wound. And that could not often, but that will sometimes kind of like trigger a response in the tree to sort of set buds. You may see like bud formation further back in. But if it doesn't set buds by like the early autumn of that year, then that branch is just essentially going to die off, I think so. But if you've got plenty of foliage, then there's a good chance that if the tree's healthy, it will put out a bud somewhere. That's just sort of generally kind of like what I would be. So don't go in there and take off too much of the needles or anything like that. Don't do anything too much. Just give it a lot of sun and just let it kind of like do its thing. Okay, because it's okay, Mark. I'll forgive you. We didn't talk about too much. Okay. So just don't give up on them just yet. Okay. So staying with pines, Steve Hale had a question about smallish white pines, 8 inches and 11 inches, which in metric is small. Second tree is a very rough bark variety. You knew the name. Is it a dwarf? Zuisho Kokonoe, perhaps. I think so. Both trees are healthy and thrive. Candles never seem to grow long enough to pinch, with 1 or 2 exceptions. What is the action to be taken in these cases, please, Peter? Okay, so we've got some of those pictures. Let's just switch that across there. So these are some of the pictures that Steve sent in. And basically, if you're getting that kind of tight extension, then you're doing a good job. That's the goal for sort of candle growth, and sort of once we get into a refinement stage, for certain, that's the kind of length and extension that we're after. If you can, I think Ian Young mentioned it in a post, in one of his posts on Instagram, about a white pine where he hasn't had to pinch, because over the last sort of 3 or 4 years he's been working on controlling the growth, controlling the number of needles around each point, and over a couple of 3 years of making sure that you're only getting 10, 12, 13 needle pairs or needle clusters, at each point, for example. If you do that over a certain number of years, then each year the bud strength is going to be pretty much the same. you're gonna be sort of restricting the amount of energy that's generated, or you're defining, not necessarily restricting, you're defining the amount of energy that gets put into each single point, and therefore, like the bud formation for the following year is going to be set and well defined. So you're going to have smaller buds, and then that new growth is only going to extend out a certain amount because there's only that much energy in the bud and in the tree and in the system. And so once the trees kind of get into this pattern of well balanced growth, and you're only getting that tiny little extension, then you're doing the right thing. And a lot of those miniature rose, the sort of the dwarfer varieties, the Yatsubusa types, or things like Kokonoe, Zuisho, are the two sort of main dwarf Japanese white pines. There are some other ones that are particularly good, for Shohin, Azuma, and there's all sorts of weird and wonderful ones. But they will naturally not extend out too much, and so you generally don't have to go in and pinch them too much. I was supposed to bring my one in and show, but basically you're basically sort of doing the right thing. And so all you would do is, where you're getting kind of like just that excessively long extension, just pinch those, or once they've extended out a little bit, go in and maybe just try and sort of cut them back so that they're going to be the same length as everything else. But yeah, don't worry about it. The only one thing I would worry about is, and not even worry, I think worry is not the I think worry is the wrong word. Okay, so on this one you can see a few little bits of purple, the purple flowers kind of at the base of some of those candles, and if it's just a little bit like that, then there's nothing too much to be concerned about. Okay. However, if you're getting a considerable amount of flowering, and even that I wouldn't say is a considerable amount, then what I would be looking at doing is, if you're getting much more flowering than that, then what I would be looking at doing is fertilising it heavily, pushing it out, making it bushy, and then coming back in and cutting the whole thing off, bare stem and all, later on in the year. But if it's only a tiny amount of flowering, then you're only going to get a small amount of bare stem, because essentially what happens, the stem grows out, the candle grows out at the base where the flowers form. Once they fall off, which is basically kind of like round about now, that section where the flowers were, that bit of branch is going to have no needles on it, and so rather than it just being a continuous branch with last year's needles and then all of this year's needles continuously, it's last year's needles, bare stem where the flowers are, and then the new set of needles. If it's only a small amount of flowering, don't worry about it. Just treat it as normal, and you'll just have to live with that tiny little bit of bare stem. Sorry, I just saw the thing. If there is a massive amount of that bare stem, then what I would be looking at doing, like a lot of people have had this year, particularly with the Miyajima white pines, then just push it, make it that big bushy growth, and then come back in, cut all of this year's growth off much later on in the year. That's what you would do with Scots pines, Mugos to a certain extent, and where you're going to get a large bare stem because of the flowering. Just a little bit of flowering, don't worry about it. So I wouldn't be too concerned about what's going on with your trees at the moment. They look as though they're pretty much in there. So the dwarf variety is either going to be Kokonoe or Zuisho, I would imagine. I mean, they both look very, very similar. It's kind of like, can be hard to tell them apart at times. But yeah, it's going to be one of those two. And so with those, the needle length is pretty much decided to put. It's a fixed sort of needle length, and it tends to bud up in a different way. We'll try and look at that in a proper stream when I can get some Zuisho, Kokonoe, and other white pines kind of all next to each other. At the moment, I've only got one Kokonoe and a crappy grafted one at the moment. So yeah, I hope that helps. Yep. Good. But yeah, you're doing it right, basically. So good. Tell us how to do it. The other question about pines, I think we'll do that. Oh, there's a couple more, so we'll stick with pines because it all follows on from each other. It was from Corinne. Okay. And Corinne says, I bought this black pine Yamadori from somebody in Belgium 3 years ago. I would like to know the species so that I can determine how to develop it. Okay, so let's just have a look at the picture. So this is a kind of a distant sort of type of picture, and this is a close-up of the bud. There we go. And that looks, it's either a Mugo or a Uncinata, which is basically a subspecies of the Mugo. It's definitely one of those two. I would say, on looking at it, it's a bit hard to say without sort of seeing the bark and everything. But it's definitely one of those two. So treat it as a single flush pine. Is what you're gonna have to do. So there we go. Sorry, just doing that. And so you said it. I think it might be Pinus uncinata. So yes, it is. Others say it's Mugo. It's definitely not Silvestris. Okay. So Mugo and Uncinata can be very, very sort of closely related to each other because they're essentially subspecies. The Uncinata is like a subspecies of the Mugo, but the Uncinata behaves a little bit closer to the Silvestris, and so you tend to get a little bit kind of like longer candle extension compared to the Mugo and things like that. So, but yeah, you'd definitely be looking at treating it as a single flush. The candles are not elongating, but new needles appear at the base. Older needles are long, strong, and sharp. Okay, so the tree is healthy. It's putting out small amounts of growth. And from what you said previously 3 years ago, it was in poor shape, 2 branches, and almost no shoots nor needles. Okay, so within a couple of years, you're getting a decent amount of foliage on there, and so 5 shoots on the entire tree. So it's moving forward. You were told at the time, I was told to pluck needles all the time, and so I did during the workshops. When you have a tree which is fairly freshly collected or is weak, the worst thing you can do is to take foliage off of it. Have the phrase, any green is good green. And when you are in a recovery stage or you're in sort of development stage, then essentially trying to keep as much foliage on the tree as possible is good. Okay, newer foliage, more fresh foliage is much more efficient at photosynthesizing than some of the older stuff, but having the older foliage on there does other things in terms of balancing hormones and sort of controlling some of the growth habit. But generally, keeping foliage on a tree is good. Right? Particularly with Mugos and Uncinata, they are slower growing trees, and they don't tend to push out big long candle extensions unless they're super healthy and really sort of well established in a pot. It takes them a number of years. It takes them much longer to sort of establish themselves in a pot compared to, say, the Silvestris. So it's always going to take you a lot longer to work on them. But keeping as much foliage on there as you possibly can, I think, is one of the key things. Going forward, try to not take any older needles off. And the only time you want to sort of starting to think about that is really when, because the Mugo and Uncinata both have this sort of growth habit, is when they start to cluster up. So one of the thing that we were sort of saying about the Austrian black pine and that multiple kind of like the buds sort of forming very close to each other, which Mugo does tend to do. Thinning that out a little bit will be of benefit to you. I do have a Mugo here, which featured in the candle pinching video, which is still a very raw piece of material. And realistically, I'm doing nothing to that. I had a good look at it this morning, and just sort of looking to make sure that those where we've got getting a lot of kind of like clustering of buds at the moment. That things are, we're getting 1 or 2 sort of good strong buds sort of forming in there. And so for this year, basically, I'm just going to do sort of very little to it at all. And then once we get towards the end of the year, I'm going to go in and thin out some of those buds. So that's something that you'll be able to sort of see. And so I think my tree and your tree are sort of in very sort of similar situations there. So my advice would be just feed it, water it in the correct amounts. So making sure that there's a good kind of balance of oxygen and water in the soil, so that the roots can develop healthily. And just try and keep as much foliage on there as you possibly can, because those needles that are there, be they young or old, are going to photosynthesize and generate energy, and that energy can then go into the roots and then go into buds for next year. And so once we get to sort of a period, maybe late July, early August, no later than the start of September, we want to be looking at kind of thinking about the styling of the tree, or where that energy is going to get sort of redistributed, and making sure that it's going into buds that we want it to, be they adventitious buds or buds at the tip or whatever that is. So I think that's probably just the best thing to do there. So I hope that answered the question. But yeah, it's definitely uncinata or mugo by the looks of it, I would say. The Pinus nigra, which is the Austrian black pine, you tend to see big long candles developing a lot there. There was one other question on pines, and then we'll answer that, and then just sorry, Ralph. You have to just sorry. If you could just expand on your question a little bit, Ralph. There. The other question about pines. Well, actually, we had two. One's not written down in there. This is from Damien Conroy. I have a Scots pine I collected 3 years ago from the west coast of Ireland, with full permission and legally. Growing in a wooden box. It's still in its field soil, and I wondered what steps I need to take to make the transfer to bonsai soil, and have I missed the window this year? You've missed the window for doing a decent repot for certain, but you've not necessarily missed the window for keeping it within the box, and then maybe sort of just trying to dig away at some of the areas of the field soil, and then looking at replacing it with something a little bit more conducive to long-term cultivation in a bonsai pot. But really what you need to do is anything that you do is going to be guided by the strength and the vigour of the tree. Collecting a tree from the wild and bringing it into captivity is a stressful situation, and the tree's got to be able to recover from that, and once it has done, and once it's starting to push new growth and push it strongly, then you can start thinking about giving it some more stress. Okay, so it was growing happily in the wild, or potentially not so happily in the wild, gets collected and brought to a completely different environment in a small box. It needs to it's going to expend energy on growing new roots. It's got to recoup all of that energy, get some more, build up sort of some storage, energy storage, particularly in the buds, not so much in the roots. But you've got to have lots of good foliage up on the top. You've got to have lots of good buds up on the top, because when you come to repot it into a bonsai soil, you're going to be messing with the roots. So any of that stored energy in the pine's roots could potentially disappear. So you're wanting a lot of kind of green up on the top. You want some good buds. So that's the first thing to do, is to make sure that you've got good, strong, healthy growth. If that's not really happening because potentially the soil is too wet, or you're having difficulties with sort of trying to get good healthy root growth, then what you can look at doing is sort of scraping away some of the stuff on the surface, making sure that there's not too many weeds in the soil, making sure that the box has got holes in the bottom or holes in the side, so that you're getting aeration through, or perhaps even just kind of like trying to dig away some parts of that soil, replacing it with bonsai soil. Once you start getting towards the roots and things like that, then you don't want to get in and like sort of too much. But the one thing that you don't want to come in and do is completely like bare root it and take off all of that sort of natural field soil, because where it was growing, there was the sort of the native mycorrhiza, the bacteria, the fungus that the tree was used to, and has been helping to feed the tree, and so you don't want to be washing that off when it comes to it. So what you could do, like I say, is like a piecemeal approach to trying to take away some of that soil. But if the tree's growing really healthily in that box, then don't do anything at all. Okay, only look at it if it's kind of like, if it's really sort of weak and struggling. So send us a picture of it. Look at the top of the tree. Send us a picture if you're sort of questioning it, what to do. But really, just look at maybe just ensuring that you've got that good balance of oxygen and water in the soil, and then the health of the tree will sort of come back from that. All right. But then once you do come to do it, I said this the night before in the Spruce stream, my approach to kind of doing repotting the Yamadori type stuff, in 95% of the cases, is once the tree is healthy enough, I feel that the tree is healthy enough, then I'll just go in and do it and put it straight into a bonsai pot. And generally, I've had very, very sort of good success with that, because it's about picking the right time to do it when you know that the tree's like got enough energy within it. So it's really kind of picking your time and taking a cue from those trees. Getting it healthy first is essential, and so thinking about the water to oxygen balance in its native soil is key. There's very few situations where you would say, Ralph, ask your question on Monday or write it in an email properly, because I didn't quite get what you were trying to say. What was I saying? Well, there are very few situations or cases where you should repot a weak tree because it's in such bad soil. Try to get the soil drying out, aerating itself out. There's no such thing really as a. I mean, there are a few really, really bad soils, but you can generally try to manage. In this country, it's a bit harder because of the rainfall, but do try to sort of manage the amount of moisture that's in there, either by tipping it up, making sure that you like drilling some holes in the side of the box to let a bit more airflow through, let a bit more water out, and things like that. So, but get the tree sort of healthy first, and then it will be able to recover from even quite severe repots. You saw some of the stuff that I was doing in the spring with some of the like the weird pine on the metal legs on a board and stuff like that. I mean, that tree's doing absolutely fine. It's doing, it's pushing growth. It's not dead. Certainly not dead, and it is growing, despite that really sort of severe repot, because I knew that it had the energy reserves within it to recover from it. Okay. Once it's used all of those energy reserves, then we might be into a sort of different situation. But it was picking the right time, and then you can do that quite severe sort of repots. Okay, so I hope that answered the question. Right, I think that's it for pines, other than Steve Brown's question, which came in just at the last minute. So Steve asked about how to kind of deal with create like a root ball. Right, Ray. You'll be able to catch it on the catch up anyway. How to sort of do this. Oh, thank you very much. I've got no viruses on my computer apparently. Go away. Sorry. Yeah. So how to work with this, and basically that's kind of continuing on from the discussion that we just had. So this tree, when I first had it, was in a big plastic pot, and in its sort of field soil. I purchased it from a collector in Spain, brought it over here, lived with it for a year, saw that it was growing strong enough, saw that it had some good strong buds coming through, even though the colour of the foliage was a little bit off. It was showing signs of good health and growing well, and then it got repotted. It was quite a severe repot, not 100% bare rooted, but there was a lot of the original soil was taken off, and it was planted into a small pot. There's some pictures up on Instagram from last year, I think, of this. If you're going to watch this evening, I'll send you. I'll put the pictures up somewhere. But yeah, it got put into quite a small pot, and into like a good bonsai soil mix. It was one which was very aerated, so there's quite a bit of pumice in there. I would say it would have been close to 50% pumice. Was what I did, I think, for that one. And it just never looked back. It just started. It grew very, very well. The root ball actually kind of began to sort of contract because there was the amount of mycorrhizae in there. Obviously, following the organic fertilizing regime and things like that, really, really sort of benefited. But yeah, it just got put into a small pot basically. A smaller pot as I could possibly go with it. When I was doing that, there was obviously the need to kind of like manipulate some of the roots around, and that was just done when it was planted. So got rid of as much of that kind of field side as possible, keeping a decent amount of it, so that it could recolonize the pot. But when we had those sort of the longer roots, just kind of like sort of bending them round within the pot, creating a very, very sort of small root ball, when it was sort of put into that, and yeah, that was it. And then you just left it to grow, and then there was a video of that sort of transition from that root ball to putting it on the slab, and basically it was just kind of like cutting through without going through any of the big thick. Any of the big sort of thick roots to get on there, but trying to keep that root ball as intact as possible. So I would recommend that you go and sort of have a look at the video that was made about this. I think it's on YouTube or somewhere. I'll send you the link otherwise. But yeah, it's just that initial repot, get all those roots, sort of wrap them around, try to get it in the smaller space as possible, and keep it that way. I don't know what else to say really about that one. Okay, let's go back to here. Have a question from Will on Spruce. Okay, so we did a Spruce stream the other day. There's a few technological glitches which were most annoying. And so I didn't get to talk about as much as I would have liked to. But this is quite a good question because Will says, I have a Colorado and Black Hills spruce. Okay, so Will's from America. Lives in the northeast of America, in Rochester. And both have similar issues. They are two cascades, basically, but both of them two cascades with two lines. So one, the apex, and then a cascading branch down underneath. Kind of similar to this. So, cascading branch, stuff up at the top. And basically the cascading branch is suffering fungal problems, which often kill off previous year's foliage. Have been dousing them with mancozeb as they push their greenery for 2 years, but this hasn't made a difference in the fall, and I can see the extent of the damage. The top branches on both trees seem to suck up all the energy, even when I prune them very well. I'm trying to return them to health so I can work on ramification. They're potted in Akadama pumice and lava mix, and don't water too much. Any thoughts on how to treat fungus on spruce in the northeast USA? Any other thoughts on how to recover health and balance energy in these guys? Okay, so spruce, obviously we sort of said in the stream, and obviously didn't get to mention it because I was an idiot. Very sort of apically dominant tree. You don't tend to see too many of them growing as anything other than really upright sort of type trees, and so making them into cascade can result in some issues. Those bottom branches are always naturally going to be quite weak, because all the energy wants to go up, and so it can be difficult to force them down into the lower branches. I think if the tree was really, really healthy, then it would be a bit easier. But obviously, with suffering from fungal issues, then that's being a sort of hampering you at the moment. So find out exactly what it is. It's obviously some type of needle cast, I'm assuming. Try and find out exactly what it is, and then what you're going to want to do is to try and treat it preventatively. So understand when those spores are going to be floating around, which is generally in the spring. Once the temperature starts to rise up, and there's a decent amount of humidity, keeping them dry is one of the key things, because all like fungal spores basically get spread by rain and in the air, on droplets of water, that type of stuff, and so misting the foliage at the wrong time of year basically is spreading the fungal spores. Any type of fungal issue that you have in trees, you have to break the cycle of reinfection from year to year. And so good hygiene is absolutely essential. So cleaning off any of the old needles, cleaning those the needles away from your benches and things like that is a key part of it. To try to make sure that happens. Just going through and taking off those old dirty needles. When we're sort of saying about with the pines, and tried to in recovery mode and trying to keep as much green on there as possible. And the idea that any green is good green. When you have older needles that are yellow or discoloured or have needle cast, they should be removed because they're not green. Okay, if it's good, luscious green, keep it. If it's yellow, discoloured, mottled, looking a little bit off, remove. Hygiene. So doing that, and then also think about lime sulfuring over the winter. Lime sulfur is a nuclear option when it comes to killing things. It will kill all bugs, good and bad. It kills a lot of the fungal spores. It just breaks. What it does, it basically breaks down proteins, and so it's really really bad for us if you get it if you drink it. It's very bad for you when you do that. But yeah, it breaks down stuff really really well, effectively, and so giving it a winter wash of that could be something to look at. And so with most conifers, what you'd be looking at is a maximum of 20 parts water to 1 part lime sulfur. Anything normally you'd be looking at around about 30. So generally kind of like do 25%. So 25 parts water to 1 part lime sulfur for everything, deciduous and conifers. You can go stronger on the lime sulfur, but basically what you end up with is a white residue, which takes a lot longer for it to come off. So it's harmful to the trees in the sense of it creating a sunscreen type effect, blocking out, having the white residue on the foliage, blocking out the sun. It's harmful from that aspect, much more than say anything else, like being poisonous or anything. So don't go too strong on that. But really, it's about identifying the cycle of what's going on. Building up disease resistance is one thing. So making sure that you're on a very good organic regime, looking at potentially some probiotic inoculations. And so there are a lot of products out there where you can try and inoculate, not lots, but there are some products out there that you can inoculate the soil with beneficial bacteria in particular. And so look at doing some of that. We've been using a product here this year, which has had some very good results so far, and yet to see any fungal issues. But I haven't really seen too much fungal issues here since I've been on a very sort of strict organic regime and using a lot of seaweed and stuff like that. So those things definitely help. What else? And then just really try to figure out what the fungus is, and also where it's coming from as well. So if you're in a fairly urban environment, but you're not as well. You've got forests around you, and so there could be some vectors, some trees which have that around, and it's coming from them. So do look at that. And if you are really sort of suffering year after year, and there's spruce everywhere that's having the same problem, then it could be quite difficult to get rid of. But yeah, it's a question of, I'd be looking at that, trying to focus on the root health, focus on hygiene, and proactively spraying with a couple of chemicals. You said you use mancozeb. Mancozeb is good, but don't just rely on that by itself. Rotate a couple of different fungicide products is what I would do. Okay, if you can try and keep the cascade branches, then do it. Okay, but realistically, when the tree has restricted energy reserves, has restricted ability to generate energy, it's going to go to the chips. It's where it's always going to go. And spruce's natural kind of desire is to grow upwards, and so trying to push it down into cascade branches is always going to be a little bit more difficult when there's a deficit of energy, when there isn't loads to go around. So other than that, I can't really sort of say anything. But those two spruces definitely backbud really well. I'm pretty certain. My experience of the Colorado, anyway, they backbud really, really well. And so I wouldn't be too massively concerned if you're starting to get leggy branches. Just look at really building up that energy in the roots. That you're getting that root health system. So I hope that kind of answers that. Would it help to foliar feed the cascade branch? Not really. Foliar feed, I never do it. What I do with my foliar feed is I take it and I pour it in the soil. Always feed the soil. You're feeding the soil, you're feeding the things that are going to help to the disease resistance. Trees don't really have the ability to absorb nutrients through their foliage. Ray asked, does it matter if it gets into the roots, lime sulfur? No, it doesn't. It would matter if you're getting a lot in there, and at a very high rate or low dilution. It would matter a lot, because then you're going to start messing with the pH and things like that. But a few little drips of diluted lime sulfur, etc., isn't going to affect it. The reason why you would see pots being covered and the soil being covered, if you may have seen pictures of it or people talking about it, is to avoid the pots from becoming discoloured, because obviously the lime sulfur will stain the pots, and it can be a real pain to get it off. And so if you've ever seen pictures or videos of people doing it in Japan where they're covering the pots, that's what they're doing for, not so much for the soil. Sulfur is used as a soil additive to acidify the soil and stuff like that, and so a little bit isn't a problem. Akiyama, my senpai, he had a white pine which was as yellow as anything. It was on the verge of death, and it had some root fungal issue, and what he did is he put it into a bath. He essentially almost bare rooted the tree, put it into a bath of diluted lime sulfur for 5-6 hours, took it out, planted it. I think 5 years later he won an award with that tree. So it's not as fatal as you could possibly do, as you would think. Don't do that to your trees though. Don't put them in baths of lime sulfur. Right, that was, like I say, it's like a proper nuclear option for some things. Is lime sulfur of any benefit to counteract pear rust? I don't know. I would imagine so. But one of the issues that you have with spraying lime sulfur when you're out of the dormant season is that it is quite aggressive, and the coating on like the coating of the white coating that it would give, and also it does sort of tend to affect very sort of soft and tender foliage. So I'll look into that one for you, Steve. Okay, hope that's the answer to that question. Right, we are getting on a little bit. So going forward, Simon Brown had a question. I have a Japanese spindle which is budding like mad, but as the buds are extending, they're dying off. Been happening for a few weeks now. What am I doing wrong? It's either a watering issue or a root issue. So basically, they're sort of extending out, and if they're dying off, becoming crispy, it's because there's not enough water getting to them, I would imagine. And so either look at your watering regime or look at your roots, the health of the roots. So look at what it's planted in. Think about that. Think about the root health. Is the vine weevil or grubs growing around in it, particularly if it's something from garden centre material and it's still in that composty like soil. Could be something along those lines. So there's definitely something happening to stop water getting to the tips. So it's either you not giving it enough water or there not being enough roots to take it there. Yeah, would be my biggest guess. Okay. Stuart Beresford had a question about chojibai. I've got a picture of it here. Here. So this is a chojibai, so Japanese flowering quince, and I saw it last year at a workshop, and at the time it was in a fairly shallow Tom Bender pot, and I suggested placing the whole thing in something deeper, which you did. Well done. Nice when people listen to me. You thought that the yellowing may be due to magnesium deficiency. I tried Epsom salts to see if that helped. This spring I repotted in a deeper pot as shown in the photo I sent last week, as in this photo, but the yellowing is more widespread this year, if anything, so any suggestions you have would be appreciated. Okay, so obviously you can see on some of that growth there, there's yellowing of the foliage, and it's not looking too great. And so deficiency of something is always a problem, or it could be kind of an issue with lockout, and so adding too much fertilizer can mess with the pH of the soil. Having too many elements, too much stuff going on in there, could be adversely affecting the chemistry that's going on in the soil, and things could just not be the elements could be there but not being able to be absorbed because the pH of the soil could be too far off. So there's windows of maximum absorbency for absorbency. Yeah, that's the word. Absorption was what I was thinking for certain elements, and so if you're too far off, on the pH of for say iron or magnesium, which are the two things that you tend to see causing a lot of yellowing, then although the elements could be present, so you added Epsom salts to it, which is magnesium, because you're off of the ideal sort of pH for absorption, it's very difficult for it to do so, or perhaps like the receptor sites, the parts in the soil which are absorbing the chemicals, holding on to them so that the roots can then absorb it. They could be full, essentially, because there's too much other stuff going on in there, or the soil biology could be off. So we mentioned about the beneficial bacteria and fungus and things like that. So possibly there isn't enough of that kind of like activity that's going on in order to break down those chemical compounds into easily absorbed pieces for the tree, essentially. So definitely still be thinking about some type of soil issue. Look at the water that you're giving it. Have a test of the pH of the soil, test of the pH of the water, and let me know. That's basically what I would say. Don't add anything extra to the soil in terms of fertilizers and chemicals and things like that. The one thing that you would be concerned about is if it's then sort of spreading to other areas. Okay, and also just do look and see, is it starting with the new foliage or is it starting from the old foliage? Right, so that's another thing that kind of like need to have a look at to really kind of like pinpoint what the problem is. And if you could take some close-up pictures of the foliage and then sort of send them to me again, then we might be able to try and sort of pinpoint where they are. But Chojibai are seemingly easy species, but they can be a real pain to grow outside of Japan, and I've never really been able to put my finger on it. In Japan, you can grow them in relatively shallow pots, not too much of a problem. But you do that in the UK, for example, and they just or America from the experience that I've had there, and they just kind of like get all upset about it. And so, as the advice that I gave you last year was to put it into a deeper pot. Once you put them into deeper pots, they do tend to do a little bit better. But clearly it's not helping. So let's have a look at the pH of the water, pH of the soil, and kind of like come back to that. That's all I could sort of really suggest. So I hope that kind of answers that question a little bit. What else have we got? From Paul Cotterill. Thanks for all the work. That's no problem. I have a nice olive, which is my first, and question is, how do I maintain its shape without damaging the health of the tree? If I leave it for another couple of months, my guess it will have grown out of shape. Some tips on pruning would be appreciated. Okay, so with olives, they're vigorous and robust trees if you have heat and sunshine. We have enough in the UK to be able to grow olives. Ideally, they're best grown in a greenhouse to give them that extra heat, extra warmth, which really pushes the growth. If you don't, outside is fine. But really, the majority of people that have the great success with them in Spain and Italy and places like that, it's almost like a hedge pruning type affair. And so allow them to sort of begin their extensions out to say 3 or 4 leaves, and then cut back to 2. And just, it also does depend a little bit on the variety. So if it is a the picture that you sent, which unfortunately was a bit not quite high enough resolution to put on here, it's a larger leaf variety, and so you don't need to kind of let it get out too much. But yeah, just kind of like stay on top of it. It's a bit of kind of like the glorified hedge pruning sort of technique. Don't let things extend off too far. Just sort of stay on top of it. Or a bit of sort of topiary. But then the key thing is that you then have to go in and every couple of months just go through and make sure that the structure is ideal. So that you're not getting any branches that are too coarse, that are sort of close to each other. You're not getting things that are growing back into the tree, or downwards or directly upwards and things like that. So you've got the idealized sort of branching structure that you're sort of working towards, but only sort of come back to that every couple 3 months. Other than that, just let it get out a little bit, bring it back to shape. Let it get out a little bit, bring it back to shape. But only cut the bits that are growing out of shape. So obviously you can have sort of stronger areas up on the top, weaker areas on the bottom. When you come in to prune it, just maybe prune those strong areas first, and then a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, a month later, come back and prune those stronger ones there. So yeah, it's really just it's a glorified hedge pruning technique. So I've got one here. I've had a few more in the past, but Oliver. They're not a good species to have around at the moment. Like getting new ones in. I stopped importing olives. I started buying any olives about 4 years ago. Because there's a disease that's spreading around Europe, which is awful. What was I going to say? But yeah, once maybe we can. I'll do a video or something on that. The only other question I seem to have... Oh, Dan Snipes. I hope that answer was... It was about spruce again. But I think that may have been answered in the stream. The difference between pinching, pruning and native spruce in development compared to a refined tree. And is there a way to pinch a spruce to develop terminal budding at the new growth, or will the budding always occur as back budding at the base of branches? I think that question was answered in the stream. There will be more information kind of about that with the taxus stream on Sunday. But yeah, you will generally tend to get the budding forming at the bases of branches rather than at the tips. Ralph asked this question about having this very sort of short window of opportunity to get those new buds at the tips. So yeah, pinching spruces can be a bit difficult when early on in the season. So have a look back at the stream and the question that Ralph asked, and then we can get onto that, Simon. And then if it hasn't been answered, then ask me again. Okay. The question from Simon, we'll answer this one there. The question from Simon Hicks, the azalea question from when he first joined. Not sure if basically how to balance energy on basally dominant trees like azaleas, strong and vigorous lower down, but considerably weaker up on top. We will be covering azaleas in great detail over the next sort of month or so, once they start to flower and finish the flowering, and we're sort of cutting them off. But really, if you've got a good strong root ball, which has been not messed around with too much, then the top of the tree should be relatively healthy. If it isn't, then what you need to do is really look at trying to get as much growth up as you can up on top. There needs to be a draw on the top to kind of, there needs to be like call for moisture and resources up on the top. So any kind of extensions that you're getting up on the top at all are good. One of the things that's very, very specific about kind of like azaleas is the kind of the vascular system, the live veins and how it forms. It's a very thin bark tree, shrub. It's not a tree, and so we have to have this ever so slightly kind of like varied thinking when compared to talking about other trees. And when that vascular system becomes damaged, which it can do very easily, then it can be very difficult to kind of get back, because they're not designed to look like bonsai. They're not. This is an incredibly artificial sort of, not their natural growth habit, and so we're going against nature with how we kind of work with them. So trying to get any good green up on the top there is key. Just letting it grow out, and how you can help that to develop is misting the top a lot. Making sure that the top's always nice and moist, and always there's a lot of water around it. Kind of that seems to really help with the development of new buds that you can start getting some youthful new buds to come out and really grow. And then just stay on top of any sucker shoots that you get growing from the lower branches. Other than that, there's not much you can do. If the live vein on the trunk looks as though it's a little bit sort of compromised or it's drying out, then you can wrap it in towels, and that helps with a loss of moisture through the paper thin bark, and absorption of moisture through it as well. So yeah, but I don't think any of your azaleas are particularly that bad. So I don't think you really should be too concerned about it. If you are, send a picture over. But all of these questions and more, lots of people have been asking kind of azalea questions. Basically, we don't do anything until about 2 or 3 weeks time. once the flowering's kind of like starting and or halfway through and things like that. So there will be a lot of azalea stuff coming up. So for all of those people who are concerned about their azaleas, just chill out. We can't cover everything all at once. It's hard enough. Try to do the few streams that we have that we do. Right. We've got a question from Richard, which I didn't put the picture up. About a juniper, and As a nursery grown juniper, having no experience of growing them before, some of the tips of branches started to go grey. I tried to see if I could see any spider mites, but not certain I have spotted any. Can you advise? Okay. How did you check for the spider mites? Is one of the questions. And also, have you looked for scale? Because the picture that we see, I've got to load it up. See if we can't get it here. Is that the one? Where's the picture? Excuse me, just bear with me. Unnamed, it's called. Right, let's get rid of that. Unnamed. That's why I couldn't find it. Downloads today. No. Oh Jesus. Here it is. Okay. The picture that you sent, it's difficult because it's a little bit out of focus. And so one of the things, if you are sending pictures and stuff into me, please try to make sure they are kind of like in focus and particularly the finer details. Audio input capture and existing. Okay. So here we go. We should be okay now. You should be able to hear me and also see a picture of this thing. So it's a little bit difficult to see with that one. Okay. For certain, but you've got a lot of flowering, and the foliage is discoloured. Okay, it's not the right type of green that it should be. Okay, it can be a bit difficult to see. All right, but blowing that up and looking at it close, the foliage does look a little bit discoloured. But obviously, with it being a little bit out of focus, it's hard to say exactly what it looks like. It's a needle type of juniper, so it's that kind of like juvenile type of foliage, okay, rather than the more mature sort of type. And so in the juniper stream, we mentioned about that with things like the procumbents and the San Jose's and things like that, where you get that needle type juvenile-ish growth, and they're much more susceptible to pests and disease. And what that looks like from a slightly unfocused view is it could be scale, and what juniper scale looks like is tiny little white circles, dots, nestled in the crevices of the needles. It tends to be, or at the base of branches, base of the foliage and it's almost always on the underside. Okay, so sort of having a look and seeing if you can't see any kind of like tiny little white dots, but it could be a little bit difficult to see because it might be that you are watering with hard water and some of the residue is hard, and some of the residue is causing the whiteness, or it could be the pollen from those male flowers. So it's a bit difficult to see, but have a good look at the foliage and see if you can't see any little white dots. Otherwise, get yourself a piece of white paper. Hold it under the foliage and rustle it a lot, and then have a look and see if you can't see anything moving. Okay, do that. Squish it, see if there's any blood, stuff like that. See if there's any smears. Okay, dust and debris and stuff won't leave a smear, but insects and stuff will do. Okay, have a look at those things and then come back to me. Okay, right. Looking at this question reminded me, was a question from, looking at this tree, sorry, reminded me from Colin Adams, could you please tell us a bit about getting ramification on malice? Okay, so basically apple species. How do you get ramification on it? It's hard. You don't. What you really need to do is you need to stop comparing it to maples and things like that, hornbeams, beeches, where you can really develop a lot of fine ramification. With a malice, this is wild apple, bit difficult to sort of see there, but there's not an incredible amount of ramification. And I've been working on this tree for years and years and years and years, and you just don't get the same level of ramification that you do. The decorative crabapple, Malice ceoboldi, you will get slightly more, but for the others, which tend to be slightly larger leaf, coarser type of growth, so thicker branches, longer nodes, and stuff like that, it can be very, very difficult to develop it. Realistically, you just approach it in the same way that you do with beech, hornbeams, the extending alternating species. Allow them to extend out, pinch the tip to stop extensions. Once the foliage is hard enough, then you can come back and cut in the stronger areas. Maybe leave those longer areas to strengthen up. Then sort of cut back. If you feed them quite heavily, you will start to get new shoots, adventitious shoots coming from old wood, not massively old wood, but from around the bases, branches, and things like that. If you pinch those extensions once they get out to say 5 or 6 leaves, so if you stop that initial flush of growth, you will potentially see second flush coming from the inside. But we don't defoliate. You can leaf cut once the leaves get a bit harder. That's something we will look at with beech, hornbeams, etc. Just to let some light into the inner sides. But really, with malice, you're not going to get that same structure and the same amount of ramification that you will do with maples and stuff like that. So half of the problem is the way in which people look at the trees, and half the problem is the genetics of the tree, and just the fact that it won't do what you want it to do. So that's pretty much all I can sort of say about that. Okay, I think that's about it. Dave Gladwin, question on the lower leaves of Hawthorn. I have curled leaves. I've checked for insects but can't see anything in the curled areas. Is there anything else that could be causing this? Potentially cold damage, frost damage. We've got a lot of that at the moment because of the really weird kind of like dips of temperature. That's one possibility. It could be some fungal issues. So look very. If the leaves are green and they're just curling over, it could well just be. It could have been aphids that have then died off, or it could be cold. If you start to see discolorations and things like that on it, then it could be something more serious. So just have a look at the type of curling. Look up like leaf curl, try and Google some fungal issues on hawthorns and stuff like that, and see if what's happening is matching up with your leaves. There was one question again from Corinne about her hawthorn and what to do with the flowers. She's got this beautiful looking hawthorn there. She mentioned about the flowers. Do you remove them or leave them on? Because they're all the flowers on the hawthorns are just starting to fade. If you want them to form berries and to appreciate them as a fruiting tree, then leave them on and just make sure that the tree's well fed and has enough green on the tree to support to generate enough energy for those berries, and it's going to support it without getting too tired. If you don't want them, cut them off. Okay. Right. Okay. Other than that, if it's a tree that's still in development, which you said that tree is, and it does look like it's still in development, I'd get rid of them. Okay. And just focus on putting as much energy into the development of the branches and such like. We are going to look at the development of hawthorn soon. I've only got 2 here, and I don't really do anything to them. I just leave them to do what they want. So we're going to look at some other hawthorns in the future. Right, we'll answer Graham's watering question, and then that's it. So Graham asked, let's try and find that question. Sorry, can't find it. Where was it, Graham? Okay. Would you recommend watering pines and junipers less than other species of bonsai? Right. Junipers, no. Not so much. Pines, you only want to water them less during certain times of the year if you are looking at reduction in needles. But what you want to be doing is approaching the same watering technique that you would use for any other tree, which is to make sure that you get the right balance of water and oxygen in the soil at all times. Okay, so for pines, mycorrhizal development is absolutely essential. I mean, it is for other trees, but essentially for pines it is very important, and making sure that there is oxygen in the soil, but which means not having too much water in there, is very, very important. But the only time you really want to be really holding back on the water, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do because it's so easy to make mistakes, is when you are looking at trying to reduce the needle length on, particularly on Scots pines. But what I would be doing with that is fertilizing less as much as anything. Realistically, the way in which you should approach watering should be the same mentality, which is the balance of water and oxygen within the pot correct? And so how you water pines, junipers, is essentially, it's the same way, but the amount is going to be dependent on so many different things: pot size, soil particle, the soil components, health of the tree, foliage mass, all of these different things. There's a couple of very, very good videos about this on Ryan Neal's the Mirai YouTube channel. Beginner thing about watering came out a couple of weeks ago, which is pretty much everything you need to know about watering. So definitely look at that. I did a voiceover for a video that they did a couple of years ago, which is basically everything that you need to know about watering. It's difficult to say other than it's about trying to achieve that correct balance. There's so many different factors that are involved, but the only times you really want to be, as I said, dialing back, not kind of like giving it the full amount with pines, is if you're trying to reduce the needle length. But it is a very dangerous thing to do, and I don't recommend it for a lot of people. Okay, so other than that, junipers are fine with water. So hope that answered everybody's questions. If I missed anything out, I'm sorry. I think I got everybody. Yep. Sent any emails. If not, send them in again. We'll try and answer them. But thank you for tuning in. And thank you for your questions. Thank you for donation. Like I said at the start of the stream, we are going to be going to the web shop type thing and doing that through that portal. So if you are wanting to donate, just hold your horses for a bit longer. Yeah, that's it, I think. So thank you very much. We'll see you this evening. Those of you that are going to tune in again. If not, there will be a stream on Sunday night about taxus. And whether or not we pinch, what we do with them, and all that kind of stuff. Other than that, yeah, thanks a lot. No beer or tea today, I'm afraid. I didn't have time to make a cup before I did it. So, yeah, hope you have a good rest of the day, and see you again soon.